1 Thessalonians chapter number 2, and we'll begin reading in verse 1. Read down to verse number 10. The message this morning just began, just a couple of weeks ago, this series in 1 Thessalonians. Looking forward to what the Lord has for us in this wonderful book. 1 Thessalonians chapter 2, verse 1. For yourselves, brethren, know our entrance in unto you, that it was not in vain. But even after that we had suffered before, and were shamefully entreated, as ye know, at Philippi, we were bold in our God to speak unto you the gospel of God with much contention. For our exhortation was not of deceit, nor of uncleanness, nor in guile. But as we were allowed of God to be put in trust with the gospel, even so we speak, not as pleasing men, but God which trieth our hearts. For neither we at any time used we flattering words, as ye know, nor cloak of covetousness. God is witness. Nor of men sought we glory, neither of you nor yet of others, when we might have been burdensome as the apostles of Christ. But we were gentle among you, even as a nurse cherisheth her children. So being affectionately desirous of you, we were willing to have imparted unto you not the gospel of God only, but also our own souls, because ye were dear unto us. For ye remember, brethren, our labor and travail, for laboring night and day, because we would not be chargeable unto any of you, we preached unto you the gospel of God. Ye are witnesses, and God also, how holily and justly and unblameably we behaved ourselves among you that believe. Whenever I begin preaching through a new book of the Bible, there are always several weeks, maybe even months of just every day just reading the book over and over and just trying to get a good grasp in my mind of the flow of the book and what the book is about. It's not studying the book, but just trying to soak your mind in the message of the book. And as I read it, I will begin to mark out preaching sections. These verses will go together. We'll preach this paragraph and get an idea of how many sermons will come out of that book. That's always a fluid object, because as you begin studying, and it takes more time in a passage, and so that kind of goes like that. But that's always my first step in trying to preach through a book, is just reading through it and getting a grasp of it in my mind. It never fails. It never fails that there will always be at least one chapter or one passage in reading through that I know that's going to be a difficult passage when I get there. Maybe it's because I have absolutely no idea what it's talking about. And I know the Lord is going to have to really help me when we get to that chapter. Maybe it's some deep doctrine. How do you explain that? Or maybe the subject is sensitive or controversial, or it's going to be very hard to swallow. When I preached through the book of Song of Solomon, every chapter was that way. There's a lot of sensitive stuff in that chapter, and every chapter was, how are we going to explain that? I have the book of Leviticus on my radar. I want to preach through the book of Leviticus. But in the book of Leviticus, there are 2 chapters that deals with a woman's monthly cycle. I haven't figured out what I'll do with those 2 chapters yet, and for that reason, I have not tackled the book of Leviticus yet. There's always a chapter. There's always a passage. When I was laying out 1 Thessalonians, I felt that chapter 2 would be the difficult chapter. That's not because it's deep or doctrinal or controversial or touchy, but Paul is defending himself against criticism. And in so doing, he lays out the marks of a model preacher. Chapter 1, model church. Chapter 2, model preacher. Chapter 1, this is what the preacher expects of the church. Chapter 2, this is what the church expects of the preacher. In defending himself, he gives us what a true preacher really should be. But in this church, I sit in that seat as pastor, so really the most direct application of this passage would be more to me than it does you. And that's a little bit difficult. For one reason, it became more convicting every time that I read it. The more times that I read this, the more I realized, I have a lot of work to do. I sure don't want to preach it as a commendation for me. I could say that this is what Paul said about himself. Let me show you how I measure up in the same way. Trust me, that is not the way I'm going to do that. But it is the model that I strive to be. So I titled it about 7 different ways, but the one that I settled on was the preacher, the kind of preacher I want to be. I suppose you could title it the kind of preacher that every church needs. But this is the kind of preacher that I want to be. I'm preaching more to myself this morning than I am to you, but this is the next passage. Now granted, I'm not new at this thing. I've been pastoring here for 25 or 26 years. So it's not like I'm trying to find my way. My preaching is pretty much what it's going to be. It's probably not going to get any better at this point. My style of preaching is pretty much stead. I'm not like I'm trying a young man to try to determine what kind of preacher am I going to be. No, what you see is what you get. My character is pretty much set. I don't feel a need to prove who I am. I know my limitations. I know my strengths. I know my weaknesses. I know what I'm good at. I know what I'm not good at. And as I studied this passage, it speaks to me. It is the kind of pastor that every church in America needs. It is the kind of pastor that I want to be. Give you a quick background on the church at Thessalonica. You remember that Paul, Silas, Timothy, they have come over into Europe. They've come to Thessalonian or Thessalonica at the beginning of that second missionary journey. And they started the first church at Philippi. They move on to this capital of Macedonia. Their ministry is short-lived there, maybe as short as 3 weeks. They literally have to escape the city under cover of night. But in the short amount of time that they were there, they preached the gospel in the synagogue. A diverse group of people got saved, and they started the First Baptist Church of Thessalonica. Now, it wasn't called the First Baptist Church, but it wasn't called the River or the Rock Fellowship. It wasn't called that either, all right? Closer to First Baptist. So they started this church. When Paul left Thessalonica, he goes to Berea, he goes to Athens, he goes to Corinth. We believe that he sends Timothy back to Thessalonica to check on that young church, and Silas goes back to Philippi to check on that church, and eventually Timothy will rejoin him in Corinth. And when Timothy rejoins him in Corinth, he gives him a report on those young believers, that brand new church in Thessalonica, how they are holding up under intense pressure. And from the letter that Paul writes back to them, 1 Thessalonians, we gather it was a positive report. Because over and over, Paul commends them for their steadfastness and their stand. In fact, so much so that they'd already begun to be a testimony in all of the other churches that were being started in Macedonia. But in this letter, in chapter 2, Paul defends his ministry and his conduct among them. And gathering from that, we learned that there had been some criticism from somebody trying to discredit him. If you can't refute the message, then discredit the messenger. I don't believe that Paul would have given such a full-throated defense of himself and his ministry and his character if there was not a compelling reason to do that. And it's not that Paul was personally offended because somebody didn't like him or because somebody was criticizing him. No, he's defending the ministry and the gospel that he was called to preach. You can't really separate the man from the message. You see, the life that you live impacts the gospel that you preach. And you can live in such a way so as to promote the advancement of the gospel, or you can live in such a way as to hinder the progress of the gospel. So it is not that he is offended or he's concerned that somebody is saying something about him. No, he knows that criticism is going to hinder the impact of the gospel message. So in this chapter, he defends himself. I want to take just a moment and I want to address something that I think is a fault in a lot of churches and independent Baptist churches. That there seems to be a man of God complex that some men promote, and I think it's very unhealthy. There are some preachers who are all about image. They want to be known as the sharp-dressed, skilled, pulpiteer, clever outline, and clever titles, promoting themselves on Twitter and social media, and every time they pass out a gospel tract, they have to post a picture of it. Every time somebody comes to an altar after they preach, they have to tell how powerfully they preached that night. They're too impressed with themselves. The ministry has become a platform for their ego. But self-promotion really has no place in the ministry. Really what we ought to strive to be is to be like Jesus, who made himself of no reputation. You don't need a reputation as America's greatest evangelist or the hardest preacher or the most fervent soul winner. No, you should strive to be as great as you could be, but you should also strive to be as humble and as unnoticeable as you can be as well. But then there's a little bit of preacher worship that goes on in a lot of churches. It's the idea that since I am the preacher, that I should be on a pedestal and I deserve special recognition and special privilege and extra applause. And I'm for honoring preachers and servants of Christ, but I'm not for honoring and giving glory that elevates a man above other people. It has always bothered me to give a standing ovation to the preacher when he comes to the pulpit. I've never seen us give one to the usher or the nursery worker. I have preached in churches before where the host pastor gave such a flowery introduction to build me up to his church that frankly I was embarrassed, because it's hard to listen to accolades that you know are only half true. You're nowhere near as wonderful as they think you are. Then there are insecure preachers who cover their insecurities by constantly reminding people how untouchable they are. I don't know how many times I've heard, "Touch not God's anointed." As if that means that you can't touch me because I'm the man of God. Did you know that verse in context is actually talking about a king in Israel, not a Baptist preacher? Criticism and slander and gossip against a preacher, as with anybody, it's wicked and it comes from a bitter heart. But you can't take one statement that is cherry-picked out of the Bible that gives you blanket immunity from criticism. You might need a little bit of criticism. The preacher puts his pants on one leg at a time like everybody else. And I know who I am. I know how unspecial I am. I know how desperately I need the grace of God just to get through the day. So let's do away with the man of God complex that says I'm special. I want to tell you, the calling of God is what is special. The commission to preach the gospel, that is what is special. And the marvel of the ministry is that God has placed that very special call on very unspecial men. That's the marvel of the gospel ministry. So Paul defends his ministry not because he's untouchable, but because his ministry and the gospel that he preaches is under attack. In his defense of himself, he gives us the traits of a great preacher. A great church in chapter 1, a great preacher in chapter 2. It is the kind of pastor that I want to be. So you have to sit there while I preach to myself this morning. But I'm going to give you 5 traits of the model preacher. When I studied this passage, here's the first thing I thought. That I want to be the kind of preacher who is a faithful steward. Look at verse number 1. For yourselves, brethren, know our entrance in unto you, that it was not in vain. But even after that we had suffered before and were shamefully entreated, as ye know at Philippi, we were bold in our God to speak unto you the gospel of God with much contention. Now, the criticism against Paul is that he was a charlatan, he was a charmer, that he had only come into Thessalonica for personal gain. In some places that Paul went, the criticism was that he wasn't a genuine apostle. He wasn't part of that original 12. Other places he went, the Judaizers said, he's preaching a false gospel. He's not even preaching the Old Testament. But here in Thessalonica, they said that he preached for selfish gain. In modern day vernacular, he's no better than the frauds that you see on TBN. He's hawking holy water or some blessed handkerchief, and he's begging you to send him a seed of faith to support his ministry. Paul's in it for the money. He swooped in here and he fed you a bunch of lies and he disappeared overnight. That's the charge against him. Now, it is a ridiculous charge. If you read later in the chapter, you'll find it is a ridiculous charge because he worked every day that he was there. And some charges are so ridiculous that they don't even, it's not even worth answering. So some accusations need to be answered. Sometimes it's just somebody that is throwing mud against the wall to see if any of it will stick. And you can't possibly defend yourself against every criticism. So here's what you have to do. You have to let the really stupid ones go. You do. If you really want to believe that I can't help you, then just go ahead and believe anything that you want to. Now, here's the way he answers this. He says, yourselves, brethren, know. Stop right there. Yourselves, brethren, know. He reminds them, you had firsthand knowledge of how I lived while I was there. You had firsthand knowledge of how I conducted myself in your midst. Don't let some slander or criticism from some enemy cloud what you know about that person. There's a church right now in another state far, far away that's going through some really big storms that may be getting bigger. And I've had several members of that church, I preached there before, I've had several members write me letters criticizing that pastor, of course anonymous, cowardly anonymous letters, criticizing me for that pastor. Here's the problem, I know him. I've spent time with him. And I'm not going to let what I know about him be clouded because of somebody's anonymous slander and somebody's anonymous criticism. In fact, 10 times in this book, he will remind them of something they know. He says in verse number 2, he says, even after they had suffered before and were shamefully entreated, as ye know at Philippi. He says in verse number 5, for neither at any time use we flattering words, as ye know. He says in verse 11, as ye know how we exhorted and comforted and charged every one of you. Here's what he's saying. Don't let somebody come in here and rewrite the history. Let what you know about me stand for itself. Now, if they think about what they know about him, here's what they would have known. They would have known, first of all, that he preached a gospel message. Look at verse 4. As we were allowed of God to be put in trust with the gospel. Think about that. He saw the gospel as something he was entrusted with. There is a principle of stewardship here. God has entrusted us with a stewardship, and I've been faithful in that stewardship. He says in Galatians 1 and verse 11, I certify you, brethren, that the gospel which is preached to me is not after me, for I neither received it of men, neither was I taught it, but by the revelation of Jesus Christ. I've been entrusted with the gospel. He says in verse number 2, he says, we were bold in our God to speak unto you the gospel of God. He says in verse number 9, last phrase, we preached unto you the gospel of God. He says in verse number 13, when you receive the word of God, which ye heard of us. Here's what Paul could do. He could stand before that church and he could confidently claim that my message has been the gospel of Jesus Christ. In effect, 2020 vernacular, go back and listen to the tapes. Pull me up on YouTube and listen to the sermons. I didn't preach anything to deceive you, and I didn't pull the wool over your eyes. I stand by what I preach because I preach the gospel of God. It's the message that he preached. I think that a preacher that has preached any amount of time would say the same thing, that over the years that I have preached some things that I have now determined I'm not too sure about. Not cardinal doctrines, not Bible convictions, but there have been some personal preferences or maybe a wrong interpretation of a passage. I don't think everything I preached has been 100% right. In fact, there have been times I've preached something and got home and thought, I'm not even sure if I believe that myself. I don't know. I think grace allows you to change your mind at least once or twice in 25 years. There's hundreds of my sermons on the internet. I think I'm pretty confident to say, go listen to any of them. I don't believe I've ever preached a false gospel in any of them. We preach the whole counsel of God, but our primary message is the gospel of Jesus Christ. There's a lot of preaching that falls into the category of rants and raves. There's a lot of preaching that falls into the category of preferences and hang-ups. And I want to be the kind of preacher who faithfully exposits the word, who boldly proclaims the gospel, who diligently searches the scripture to find out what God says, not what man says. He says, you know. He preached a gospel message. And then here's the second thing they would have known, that he preserved against godless men. When you read Acts 17 and 18, you see that the ministry in Europe was conducted under pressure and under persecution. I mean, at Philippi, beaten and jailed, and Thessalonica had to escape by night, and then Berea, chased by the unbelieving Jews out of town, and then what was the next place? Athens, and ridiculed by the intellectuals, and then Corinth was taken to court and falsely accused. But the pressure and the persecution was a witness for him, not against him. I tell you that a fraud probably would not endure all of that pressure preaching a false gospel. Persevered against godless men. In fact, years later, Paul would write back to the Corinthian church, and he would reflect on his state of mind when he came to them from Thessalonica. Here's what he says in 1 Corinthians 2. He said, I determined not to know anything among you save Jesus Christ and him crucified, and I was with you in weakness and in fear and in much trembling. He said in 2 Corinthians 7 and verse 5, for when we were come into Macedonia, our flesh had no rest, but we were troubled on every side. Without were fightings, within were fears. He says, I tell you, that's the pressure that I endured as I came into Macedonia. I had fightings on the outside and fears on the inside, but he just kept on preaching. And when you can weather the storm of persecution and criticism and slander and opposition, and you just keep standing, you become a witness unto yourself to this world that you are real. As a preacher with a faithful stewardship. When I look at this passage, not only do I want to be a preacher with a faithful stewardship, but I thought secondly, I want to be the kind of preacher who has a clear conscience. Look at verse 3. For our exhortation was not of deceit, nor of uncleanness, nor in guile. But as we were allowed of God to be put in trust with the gospel, even so we speak not as pleasing men, but God, which trieth our hearts. For neither at any time use we flattering words, as ye know, nor a cloak of covetousness, God is witness, nor of men sought we glory, neither of you, nor yet of others, but when we might have been burdensome as the apostles of Christ. It was said that in that day, just like now, that religion was full of hucksters and frauds, and religion has always been perverted by heretics and money grubbers. Probably the biggest accusation against most preachers is that they're in it for the money, and maybe some are. It seems like that was the main charge against Paul. He came in here to make a gain out of you. He was after your money. Paul defends himself against that. 2 years ago, Brother Wayne Munn joined our church and placed Fishers of Men Ministries under the auspices of Victory Baptist Church. Honored to have Brother Munn and Sister Munn in our church. And they've been in the ministry for so many years. Of course, you know, they live and they're based out of Bonsecker, Alabama. That's where the house is. That's where they live. That's where the ministry offices are. And so when they joined here, we didn't see any need for them to move the support address, to move over here physically, to move an office over here. There was no need to do that. And so they manage that ministry from over there. They do their own bookkeeping and they take care of all of that there. And so none of the support runs through here. Brother Munn is very circumspect when it comes to accountability. Now, you wouldn't know this, but twice a year, Brother and Sister Munn will make an appointment, usually in January and June if we can get together. And they will come over and they'll sit down in the office and they will bring a complete financial reporting of every single transaction out of that ministry. Here's every dollar in support that came in. Here's every check that was written. It is a detailed financial accounting. Now, to be honest with you, I don't look at it too close. I do look at it. I review it. I have a file. And I don't look at it too closely because I have such confidence in Brother Munn. It is really more his peace of mind, his accountability, than for my peace of mind. In fact, if I never saw another financial report from Brother Munn, I would have zero questions as to his integrity. This is just what it is. But I appreciate the desire for accountability. The integrity that says, look at anything that you want to look at. That's essentially what Paul is saying. He says it's not of deceit, it's not of uncleanness, nor in guile, not as pleasing men, but God. Look at it, if you would, in verse 3. He says, our exhortation was not of deceit. I never lied to you. I never tried to deceive you. I didn't shade the truth. I didn't have some ulterior motive. I didn't preach under hidden pretense. No, my message was pure. My motives were pure. Then he says, nor of uncleanness. Now, why would Paul use that word? What's he referring to? Because the word uncleanness in your Bible often, not always, often refers to sexual immorality. It often refers to fornication. And false religion and fornication has always gone hand in hand. In that day, many of the Greek cults featured sexual perversions as part of their pagan cultic worship. A lot of the temples had temple prostitutes who lived in the temple, and they were there for the sexual gratification of either those pagan priests or for men worshipers that came in. And it was not uncommon for pagan temples to have orgies and every kind of sexual perversion that you could possibly have. Maybe there was that charge against Paul that he was an adulterer. There's been a lot of preachers that have been caught in adultery. There's been a lot of preachers who have been falsely accused. When a preacher falls into sexual sin, I believe that he disqualifies himself, and he should not be in the ministry. But before you repeat an accusation against a preacher, you better make sure that you got the goods. You better make sure you know whereof you speak. Paul says, I preached a pure message. I lived a clean life. You never saw me act untoward toward any lady. You never saw me to conduct myself in an unseemly manner with a member of the opposite sex. It was not of deceit, it was not of uncleanness, nor in guile, cunning, duplicitous, deceptive. Seems to be very similar to bait and switch. The serpent beguiled me. She was lied to. You never saw me do that. It says in verse 4, not as pleasing men, but God. My conscience is clear that I didn't shade the truth for fear of men, verse 2. For the favor of men, verse 4. I held nothing back. I was faithful to preach the truth to whoever was sitting in front of me. It says down in verse number 5, but neither at any time use we flattering words, as ye know, nor a cloak of covetousness. Flattery is a form of exploitation. When somebody flatters you, they are manipulating you. It is insincere praise for impure motives. It is often a pretext. It is a cloak to hide what your true motives are. And Paul said, I never use flattering words as a cloak for covetousness. And I love what he says in verse 5, and he says it twice. He says, God is witness. Not only you saw how I conducted myself, God saw it. I'm willing to stand on the witness stand before God, talk to him, and ask him what he thought of my life and my ministry. It's one thing to open up yourself to the scrutiny of man. It's another thing to open yourself up to the scrutiny of God. You know what every church in America needs? It needs a preacher that can stand with a clear conscience and a clean life. Somebody who is faithful in doctrine and true to his convictions and bold in proclamation. I told you it was convicting to me. I want to be the kind of preacher that has a faithful stewardship. And I want to be the kind of preacher that has a clear conscience. And I want to be the kind of preacher that has a gentle spirit. Look at verse 7. But we were gentle among you, even as a nurse cherisheth her children. The most gentle creature in the world is a mother with a baby. And Paul uses that metaphor as a picture of how he cared for them. He takes the most tender, the most compassionate, the most gentle, the most nurturing relationship and says, that's how I was when I dealt with you. If you back up to verse number 6, he says, nor of men sought we glory, neither of you nor yet of others. Watch this. When we might have been burdensome as the apostles of Christ. In most of the Pauline epistles, Paul addresses himself as an apostle. Paul, the apostle of Jesus Christ. That is authority. But when he came to Thessalonians, he didn't throw his weight around as an apostle. He could have done that, but he didn't do that. He said, I was more like a mother to you than an apostle. There's no authority in that metaphor. There's no power. There's no dominance. I came to you as gently as a mother is with her infant. Now, I know that men have different personalities. And I know that God gives some men a harsher tone than others. And I know that there are some men who are just hard in the pulpit. I have met men who are hard in the pulpit, but who are just as kind and compassionate as anybody else outside the pulpit. Some of the hardest preachers I know have the softest hearts. Really do. My dad can be a very hard preacher. Now, I don't think my dad's only preached one hard message in this church. Right? But my dad, when my dad pastored, my dad could really lay it down. Well, my dad can be tough. But you'll look a long time before you find somebody who's more generous than my dad. I don't know anybody that gives more away than my dad does. So you can be hard in the pulpit and be bold. And sometimes a preacher gets a reputation for being hard and bold, but then that's balanced with gentleness and kindness. You can be bold and gentle. There are some preachers who pride themselves in being rude and insulting and offensive. You can tell what a man thinks about people by the way that he preaches to them. And when a man preaches down to people, that's not spirit-filled, that's self-filled. And even if you have to approach a controversial subject and you know that it's going to hurt somebody, you don't want to intentionally hurt anybody. I don't want to intentionally be offensive and upsetting and insulting. I certainly don't want to be misunderstood. I would rather be known for my love of people than my knowledge of the Bible. You can love people with gentleness. And we've forgotten Galatians 5:22, but the fruit of the Spirit is love, joy, peace, long-suffering, gentleness, goodness, faith, meekness, temperance. 2 Timothy 2 and verse 24, the servant of the Lord must not stray, but be gentle unto all men, apt to teach patience. Nobody admires harshness in either a man or a woman. When a man is harsh and cold and rude, nobody says what a fine man that is. And when a woman is loud and boisterous and petulant, nobody says, oh, what a lovely lady. No man who is truly good, no man is truly great who is not gentle. And if you have courage and boldness, but you lack gentleness, there is a character flaw in your character. And by the way, for us men, isn't it strange that we can be the least gentle to the person that we're supposed to love the most? What my wife needs and what yours needs is a gentle soul to comfort and solace and encourage. My wife doesn't need me to point. I don't know. This is not in the text. My wife doesn't need me to point out her faults. She already knows what they are. And my wife married a preacher, but she didn't marry one so she could get a sermon a day. She doesn't need me to preach to her. Every human heart longs for tenderness. We are made for love. And I want to be the kind of preacher that you know where I stand and my doctrine is clear and I'm not afraid to preach convictions, but may that not be all that I am known for. I want to be the kind of preacher you can call anytime. Drive across the country to help you. Give the shirt off of my back. I want to be a preacher with a gentle spirit. I want to be the kind of preacher who has a sacrificial heart. Look at verse number 8. So being affectionately desirous of you, we were willing to have imparted unto you, not the gospel of God only, but also our own souls, because you were dear unto us. For ye remember, brethren, our labor and travail, for laboring night and day, because we would not be chargeable unto any of you. We preached unto you the gospel of God. He's still answering the charge that he was there just to take something from them. And so he reminds them that when I was there, we didn't take any offerings from me. I didn't raise any support. You didn't put me on salary. No, I actually worked, he said, laboring night and day. I worked physically in his trade, which is tent making. I worked physically to support myself. And Paul would later write that a laborer is worthy of his hire, and that those who minister have a right to expect that those that he ministers to ministers back to them in carnal things. It is right for a church to pay a preacher when they can, and I say that very easily because this church does great with that. But here he's making the point, I didn't take anything from you because I didn't want unbelievers to use it against me. I preached to you and I took nothing from you. He says, I gave of you my very soul. Preaching and ministry is not a side job, it's a life calling. And a man may have to work a job on the side. He may have to be bivocational. But even then, he still puts his heart and his life, his soul. He puts everything into that work. He has to be willing to make any sacrifice. He has to be willing to accept any denial. A ministry that changes the world will cost you everything. Many of the preachers who spent their life in ministry and preaching came to the road, into the road completely spent and gloriously satisfied. I want to be the kind of preacher that has a sacrificial heart. When I look at the text, here's my last thing. I want to be the kind of preacher that has a clean life. Verse 10. Ye are witnesses in God also, how holily and justly and unblameably we behaved ourselves among you that believe. Paul says, if you'll go back to my interaction with you, you will know that I conducted myself as a holy man. Oh, there's so many accusations, but which of you can lay a legitimate blame on me? Not just in my preaching, but in my business dealings with you, with my personal interactions. I left town and paid all my bills. I didn't know you anything. I didn't skip out on any bills. I wasn't dishonest. I wasn't a cheat. I didn't cavort with loose women. I lived a holy life before you. I lived a clean life. Now, I understand this morning that this passage applies more directly to me than it does to you. I believe that all 5 of these character traits ought to be in all of us. You don't have to be a preacher to want to have this kind of character. But I made it personal to me. I made it personal to me because as I studied it, it was personal to me. And I think that you ought to make it personal to you. What kind of testimony do you have? What kind of private life do you live? Are you the kind of man that can say, I have a faithful stewardship, and I have a clear conscience, I have a gentle spirit? Oh, that's a tough one. I have a sacrificial heart, and I live a clean life. How many of you are thankful this morning for the church? Say amen. How many of you are thankful for the preachers? Not this one. How many of you are thankful for any preacher? Say amen. Hey, think about it. That in your past, God has put a preacher in your life. Maybe it's a church that you grew up in. Maybe it's a church that you got saved in. Maybe it's a church that really discipled you. But God put you in a church somewhere, and there was a preacher there that preached, and he had a great impact on your life. Do you think about it? Thank God for him. My dad turned 78 yesterday. Turned 78. When I read 1 Thessalonians 2, I think about my dad. That's the kind of man that my dad is. Thank God for preachers. Thank God for spiritual leaders who have an impact upon us. Thank God for every father, for every mother who models this kind of character before their children.